America has many unsung heroes who were recognized quietly for their heroic feats. Now, in his new book, Sleep in Peace Tonight, which is a novel, author James McManus, he recounts the story of Harry Hopkins, who was one of President Franklin Roosevelt's in real life most trusted advisors. And while Hopkins was never elected to any official office, President Roosevelt often confided in him more than most of his aides. Now, I spoke with Mr. McManus about how Hopkins helped Roosevelt through World War II. Well, if you could first, I know it's a novel, but how much of it is fiction and how much of it is based in historical accuracy?
Well, this is a historical novel in which I've taken great care to be very accurate about the history. But obviously, being a novel, there is fiction within it, and one of the major characters in this novel is a woman called Leonora Finch, with whom Harry Hopkins, my main protagonist, has an affair in London. But I have to tell you, this is very likely to have happened. So most readers of this book, I think, will come away from it with a much better idea of what was going on in London in 1941 and what the very high stakes were there for both the US and for Great Britain.
Well, set the stage in 41 because we know the Blitz was happening. In going through the book, you don't really realize, or at least the newer generation, how acute and how desperate the situation was, how Churchill was so low on funds, and at the same end, how particularly acute the desperation was in England. Set the stage for what it was like in 41 in England.
You're absolutely right. It was a desperate time in which Great Britain faced defeat. The Nazis had swept across Europe the previous summer, and Hitler was in control of the continent. Churchill knew that the only way Britain could survive was with American aid. He was desperate for that help. What Roosevelt did was to try and find out exactly what was going on, and thus he sent as an envoy Harry Hopkins. Now, Hopkins was a slightly unlikely envoy. He was a White House insider, unelected, widely regarded in Washington as just a crony of the president. He'd never been to Great Britain before, and his opinions were really isolationist, if anything. So when Hopkins arrived on January the 9th, 1941, and he did so, I may say, in the middle of a very heavy air raid, Churchill immediately sat him down and had a long meeting, knowing that he, Churchill, had to win and woo this man. And it is to Hopkins's huge credit, and why we owe him so much, I think, in Great Britain, that he very quickly came to the view that it was in the United States' best interest that they did help Britain at this critical juncture of the war. And he began to relay Churchill's very long list of war demands to Roosevelt.
You know, you take pains here to explain that I think we all have maybe a convenient view of history, but from the industrialists of the Henry Fords to the Charles Lindberghs of the rest, there was a prevalent isolationist view that we had enough to worry about stateside here. We didn't need to be going off into Europe when it wasn't America's fight. So FDR had that challenge stateside, and as you said, it was an interesting choice of an envoy. I'm curious, how did he get so close in the inner circle, since he was an unelected official of FDR? How did the protagonist in this particular book get that close to the president?
That's a very good question. Harry Hopkins came from Sioux City in Iowa, and he was very much a boy brought up on the Corn Belt, with all the attitudes that sort of implies, isolationist and pacifist. He got to Washington in the early 1930s, and he proved himself immediately to be a master at the bureaucracy, a bureaucratic management, a cutting through red tape, and this attracted him, attracted Roosevelt to him. And Roosevelt needed someone like that, a real political backroom boy who could operate for him. Now, of course, in those New Deal programs, Hopkins was a very important element in getting them through. But this created great animosity in Washington. Hopkins was deeply unpopular, obviously with the Republicans, who hated the politics of the New Deal, but equally with the Democrats, who distrusted the kind of access that Hopkins was getting with the president.
You know, James, there's some notable cameos. Jimmy Stewart's got a cameo in the book, but Edward R. Murrow, he's a prominent player in this book, and in your retelling of it, he was a very loud voice when it came to Harry Hopkins about the importance of the U.S. involvement in Europe. How real was that?
It was absolutely true. And this is where I've been very careful to get the historical record right. Ed Murrow was a great CBS correspondent, a great American journalist, and he was in London throughout the war. And he knew from very early on, the moment in fact that Churchill became Prime Minister, that it was in, again, America's interest that they get alongside Britain to defeat the fascist peril in Europe. And it was Murrow's broadcasts that did so much to really turn around American opinion and make people, even in the sort of the Midwest and the South, which was the heartland of isolationism.
You know, finally, James, when you put it in today's context, you don't have to stretch to wonder if a similar threat emerged. And obviously, you look at the Middle East in a much broader context, I suppose, but there's a weariness on the part of the American public, and I'm sure our European allies as well. And there's a cynicism as to what is our fight and what isn't. If this was played out in present day, would it take a Murrow, would it take an FDR, a Churchill, etc., to rally the public here? Or eventually does the public get the message through Technicolor what is and isn't in national interests?
Well, that's a good and complicated question which has several layers of answer. But firstly, let me just say, in World War II, the issue was stark and it was clear and it was black and it was white. It was Western democracies against Hitler's fascist tyranny. And there was no room for ambiguity in that when you looked at that situation. Secondly, there were great leaders on the table then. Roosevelt, Churchill, and latterly in the war, of course, Stalin came in with Russia against Germany. Now, Hopkins's role was to create a relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, to create a kind of a line of communication, and that he did. You can't really compare that situation with today, where we have a much more complex multilateral world, and, dare I say it, perhaps don't have quite the great leaders that we had then in World War II.
Well, it's a fascinating read, and as we said, it is a novel, and it reads like one, but also with a lot of historical fact interwoven throughout. Again, sleep in peace tonight. James McManus, I really appreciate it for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Up next, we will have a look at news making headlines in the Hudson Valley. Stay with us.